You are listening to Deadly Truths, where history meets homicide and the facts are often stranger than fiction. I'm your host, Becca, and every episode we uncover the real stories behind the headlines, from forgotten murders and military crimes to haunted prisons and small town secrets. These are the stories buried in archives, whispered about in local legends, and sometimes still waiting for justice. Every story has a name, every crime has a consequence, and every truth deserves to be told. Today, we're not chasing a killer, we're chasing a ghost. A ghost with perfect hair, a hero complex, and a reputation that refuses to stay buried. Before his last stand at Little Bighorn, George Armstrong Custer was Leavenworth's most ambitious nightmare. He swaggered through Fort Leavenworth like he owned the place. Half golden boy, half walking midlife crisis. Except he wasn't even 30. Back then, the 30s were a midlife crisis because, let's face it, you were lucky if you made it to 50. Leavenworth back then wasn't the penitentiary punchline it is now. It was the Army's front porch. Every campaign heading west started in Fort Leavenworth. Picture limestone walls, parade drums echoing off the river bluff, officers in pressed blues trying to look heroic while swatting mosquitoes and sweating like crazy. Into that strolls Custer, Civil War prodigy, adored by reporters allergic to humility. He shows up in his bright red scarf, gold curls bouncing, convinced that the bugler should play his entrance theme. He's 26, he's famous, and already believes history's waiting for his autograph. When George Armstrong Custer arrived at Fort Leavenworth, he was already a national celebrity, practically a Civil War rock star. His fame came from a mix of bravery, a lot of luck, political connections, and relentless self promotion. So let's explain why he was such a big deal when he arrived at Leavenworth, the boy general of the Civil War. Custer shot to fame during the Civil War, where he became the youngest brigadier general in the Union Army at just 23 years old. You gotta admit, that's kind of impressive. He led cavalry charges at battles like Gettysburg in 1863, where his aggressive tactics helped turn the tide on the Union's right flank. Then you have Yellow Tavern in 1864, where Confederate General J.E.B. Stuart was killed. He was flashy, he was fearless, and he loved attention. Soldiers said he'd ride into battle with a red scarf, gold-trimmed uniform, and a dog trotting beside him. Pure spectacle. The press loved it, of course. And yes, even back then, you had press. So on top of this, Custer was tall, he was handsome, he had long golden hair, and he knew it. The newspaper and Harper's Weekly sketches painted him as this romantic young hero of the Union cause. He became a media darling, something very few military officers ever achieved in that era. His nickname was the Boy General, made him sound like a mix between a prodigy and a celebrity. On top of all of this, he also married really well. In 1864, he married Elizabeth Libby Bacon. She was the daughter of a politically connected Michigan judge. Libby became his biggest cheerleader. She later wrote glowing books and letters that kept his legend alive, so clearly all that helped. Together, they understood publicity. Custer often invited reporters to cover his campaigns. He gave them quotes. He made sure his exploits hit the front page. But we've got to talk about the elephant in the room. He was brave, but he was also really reckless. Custer led from the front, often charging into battle so dramatically it looked like a movie scene. His soldiers admired his courage, but they also joked that he had a death wish. That kind of reckless bravery made him famous. and infamous. By the time he was sent to Fort Leavenworth, and this was around 1866 to 1867, he wasn't just another officer, he was a Civil War hero, nationally known, politically connected, and already controversial. He symbolized a post war America looking for heroes. After the Civil War ended, the nation was weary and fractured. Custard represented youthful patriotism, victory, and he was daring. The Army used him to inspire troops and the public during the westward expansion. When he arrived at Fort Leavenworth, the gateway to the frontier, it was like sending a celebrity influencer to a military base. Everyone knew who he was, and he acted like it. After the Civil War, the Army demobilized. Most volunteer officers, they went home. Custer, however, wanted to stay famous. He accepted a permanent commission as lieutenant colonel of the newly formed 7th U.S. Cavalry under the command of Major General Winfield Scott Hancock. Oof, that's a long name. His assignment was to help the Army pacify the Plains tribes and protect westward expansion. That's how he was transferred west to Kansas. But Leavenworth has a way of humbling people. It's seen every kind of ghost, commanders shot by their own men, soldiers who vanished on patrol, widows who never left their quarters. The locals swear the fort breathes at night, and maybe that's just the Kansas wind, or maybe it's the sound of egos deflating. Custer did not hear it, though. He was too busy hearing himself. So when Custer got to Fort Leavenworth, it was the main headquarters and supply hub for the U.S. Army on the western frontier. Fort Leavenworth was the main base for operations for what they called the Indian Territory. Officers received their orders, they trained their troops, and they led expansions from there. Custer arrived as one of the Army's star cavalry officers. He stayed briefly at Leavenworth while organizing his command. He was gathering his supplies and preparing for General Hancock's spring 1867 campaign across Kansas. So for Custard, he would have looked at Leavenworth as his staging ground for his new frontier career. By 1867, he had managed to turn his gift for chaos into official charges, though. General Hancock's plan was to show military strength in the plains, particularly with the Plains tribes, after a series of raids. Custer and the 7th Cavalry rode west from Fort Leavenworth to join Hancock at Fort Leonard and Fort Hayes and towards Fort Wallace near the Smoky Hill Trail. But things went wrong, and they went wrong fast. The campaign was plagued with deserters, illnesses, and poor logistics. Hancock provoked hostilities by burning several Cheyenne lodges and sparking all-out war. Custard himself fell ill. There's different accounts. It might have been malaria or dysentery. In other words, he had the shits. He started blaming everyone but himself. While stationed near Fort Wallace, Custer decided he had had enough. He left his command without permission, taking a small escort and riding 275 miles east back towards Fort Riley to see his wife Libby, claiming, he didn't feel good. He left his men behind in brutal conditions and even ordered the shooting of deserters without proper trials. Ugh, that did not look good. Word of his behavior spread fast. He abandoned his post, he disobeyed orders, and my favorite part, rode off to see his wife Libby. Romantic, sure. Also, military desertion. Hallmark does not make a card or movies for that. The Army court-martialed him right there at Fort Leavenworth. The boy general became the suspended major, sentenced to a year off with no pay. All of this is something that most people never talk about, so I thought it was really important to get the details straight. So he was charged with leaving his post without permission, misusing government property, ordering illegal executions, conduct unbecoming an officer. Now, most people would take that time to reflect. Custer took it to network. He wrote letters to senators, flattered generals, and leaked his own sob story to the press. He was the prototype influencer. No ring light, just righteous indignation and a killer jawline. If you visit Leavenworth today, the old officers' quarters still stand. Locals say on cool nights you can hear boots pacing in the gravel courtyard. Some blame restless spirits. Me, I think that's just Custer. He's still rehearsing his apology tour. Halloween at Fort Leavenworth always hits a little different. There is Custer House in Fort Leavenworth, of course. The location is 1 Reynolds Avenue. It was built in 1855. Now, it's a restored historic home and museum, and it is one of the oldest surviving residences on post and absolutely soaked in ghost stories if you go to visit. The real history, though, is the house you see today is known as the Custer House, but technically it was not his private home. It's a replica of the quarters where Custer and Libby lived when he was stationed at Fort Leavenworth in the late 1860s. The original building burned down in 1871. Dang those fires. They're always burning down those historical landmarks. The Army rebuilt it to the same floor plan and architectural style, which is the Greek Revival limestone, with symmetrical windows, fireplaces, and porches overlooking the parade ground. So while the exact structure is not the one he slept in, it is a faithful reconstruction of the house that Custer and his wife did occupy. Why does it still matter? The Custer House represents the social life of Leavenworth's elite officers before the Indian Wars exploded. It's the spot where Custer entertained visiting dignitaries, where Libby wrote letters defending his honor, and where his vanity probably glowed brighter than the oil lamps. It also symbolizes the duality of Custer's life, elegance and arrogance on the inside, chaos and consequence on the outside. There are ghost stories, of course. And oh, yes, it's supposed to be haunted. The staff and visitors have reported footsteps pacing upstairs when no one's home, a soldier's boots clicking across the porch at night, doors opening and closing by themselves, and the scent of pipe smoke when the house is empty. Some swear it's Custer himself, restless and still waiting for someone to tell him he's forgiven. Others say it's Libby, internally defending her husband's reputation. Either way, the Custard House is a cornerstone of Fort Leavenworth's haunted legend, and it's a must visit if you go on a tour. It's open to the public as part of the Frontier Army Museum tour program. Visitors can walk through period rooms furnished to look exactly as they did in the 1860s, including the parlor, bedrooms, and officers' dining area. And you could literally stand technically in the same space where Custer's ego met military protocol head on. Or maybe ghosts really do return to the scene for their ego. Because if any soul was going to haunt a military fort out of pure vanity, it would definitely be Custer. He wasn't satisfied with medals. He needed mythology. He rode faster than his scouts, dressed flashier than his peers, and picked fights like it was cardio. Leavenworth tried to teach him patience. He learned publicity instead. When his suspension ended, he marched straight back into the spotlight. The press had framed him as the misunderstood genius. The Army called him reckless. Both were right. His next stop was the 7th Cavalry, and we all know how that ended. And if you don't, shame on you. You need to read a history book for goodness sake, or listen to my podcast. Neither one works. But the seeds of disaster were planted right there on Kansas soil. Leavenworth didn't just witness Custer's rise, it documented the rehearsal for his fall. Every ghost story from that fort feels like a cautionary tale about him. Think about it. Leavenworth is built on layers: frontier, executions, the endless churn of ambition. It's where young officers learn the rules before they break them. And Custer broke them with style. Fast forward 9 years to June 1876. Custer divides his troops, underestimates his enemy, and rides straight into history's punchline. over 200 men die. The boy general becomes the dead legend. So let's take a very detailed look at that. On June 25th, 1876, Little Bighorn River, Montana Territory. The United States was in the middle of its westward expansion, and the government had just violated another treaty, this time demanding all the Native Americans move onto reservations. When many Lakota, Sioux, and Northern Cheyenne bands refused, the U.S. Army sent 3 columns to force them in. Custer's 7th Cavalry was part of this campaign, heading west from Fort Abraham Lincoln and what's now known as North Dakota. Custer's orders were to find and attack a large native encampment led by Setting Bull, Crazy Horse, and Gall along Little Bighorn River, and he was told to wait for reinforcements. Going to give you a moment to hear that again. He was told to wait for reinforcements, but in classic Custard fashion, he did not wait. On the morning of June 25th, 1876, scouts spotted a massive village, hundreds of lodges, thousands of warriors. Custer, convinced it was smaller than it looked, divided his 600 men, so it was a 600-man regiment, into 3 battalions. He personally led about 210 men. That decision sealed his fate and his men's fate. Custer's force attacked the northern end of the village, while Major Marcus Reno hit the southern end and Captain Frederick Bettine flanked left. But the size and speed of the native resistance was overwhelming. Instead of a few hundred that Custard expected, there were roughly 1,500 to 2,500. The 7th Cavalry was quickly surrounded. Reno and Bettine were pinned down and unable to reach Custard's position. Within 1 hour, Custard's command was completely wiped out. Every man killed. No one from Custard's direct command survived, so the exact details of his death are unknown, but the battlefield told a grim story. When soldiers later found the bodies, Custard lay in a shallow depression near the top of what's now called Last Stand Hill. His brother Thomas Custer, his nephew Auntie Reed, and his brother-in-law, James Calhoun, were dead nearby. Custer had 2 gunshot wounds, one to the chest, one to the temple. The most accepted theory is that he was first shot in the chest, then a final shot to the head ended it. Most believe the shot to the temple was self-inflicted to avoid capture. Unlike many others, Custard's body wasn't scalped or mutilated, which was rare. Several native accounts said the Lakota recognized him and respected his bravery. They left his body intact, though stripped of uniform and weapons. Custard's remains were first buried on the battlefield, but later moved to West Point Cemetery in New York. His death hit the nation like a shockwave. Within weeks, newspapers turned the defeat into a myth of heroism. Custard's Last Stand. And I know that any of you history buffs are familiar with that, right? Custard's Last Stand. That's what I grew up learning about. He went from reckless officer to a martyr overnight. Libby Custard spent the next 57 years turning her husband into a national icon. Through books, lectures, and interviews, she reframed his downfall as a story of gallant sacrifice. Custard wasn't remembered as the man court-martialed at Leavenworth, and still to this day, most people do not know about that. He was remembered as the boy general who died for his country. Can't you just imagine him looking out over parade grounds, watching new recruits march in tight lines, whispering, "Don't listen to them. Glory is worth the risk." Then the wind kicks up, the river moans, and the fort remembers what that attitude cost. Leavenworth trains discipline, but it also remembers arrogance. You can feel it like static before a storm. Maybe that's why Halloween stories from there always circle back to Custer. Not because he's the scariest ghost, but because he's the most familiar. The one who reminds us how quickly admiration can rot into legend. He wanted to be eternal, mission accomplished, but not the way he pictured it on those long Kansas nights. The truth behind the legend is far less heroic and far more human. George Armstrong Custer wasn't a fearless martyr. He was a man who never learned when to stop performing. At Leavenworth, he was warned. He was disciplined for the same recklessness that later defined his legend. The Army tried to teach him restraint, but Custer treated consequences like background noise. He left Leavenworth with an ego intact, and his lessons were unlearned. 9 years later, he rode into Little Bighorn the same way he rode through life, certain he was untouchable. He underestimated his enemy, ignored his orders, split his men when he should have stood united, and led them all straight into disaster in their deaths. The perfect Custard ending, spectacular, self-assured, and soaked in irony. He got the immortality he always wanted, but he got it in death. And that's why his ghost still fits so neatly inside Fort Leavenworth's walls, because that's where the story of his downfall really begun. We have to face the truth about Custer. He did not die as a hero. He died the way he lived, chasing glory, surrounded by chaos, and haunted by the echoes of his own legend. George Armstrong Custer is often used in officer training programs, including West Point Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth and the Army War College, as a classic case study of what not to do as a leader. And here is why. Custer's biggest failure was underestimating the enemy and ignoring intelligence. At places like West Point, where, by the way, Custer graduated last in his class in Fort Leavenworth's command in General Staff College. His name still comes up when they are discussing topics like overconfidence in command, failure to coordinate with subordinates and superiors, breaking chain of command. Instructors use the Battle of Little Bighorn as a cautionary tale of hubris, disobedience, and lack of reconnaissance, a lethal mix that got over 200 men killed. In military leadership studies, it's called the Custer syndrome. It is shorthand for a leader who lets ego override judgment. It's often used when teaching risk assessment and mission planning. The message, confidence is essential, arrogance is fatal. Custer is compared to leaders like Robert E. Lee at Gettysburg or Rommel in North Africa, who at least adapted to reality when things fell apart. Custer never did. He doubled down on his own myth. And here is the poetic twist. At Fort Leavenworth, where Custer was court-martialed for insubordination, today stands the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College, the institution that trains mid-career officers in advanced leadership, ethics, and operational strategy. And yes, they still reference Custer's career, as I had mentioned, as a case study in leadership failure. He's literally used on the same ground that once tried to teach him humility. You couldn't script irony better. I think that it's really important to understand that modern military instructors don't erase his bravery. He was definitely brave. There's no denying that. But they do contextualize it. They point out that courage without discipline isn't leadership. Custer's problem wasn't that he lacked guts. He had guts. That's great. But what he didn't have was self-control, teamwork, and respect for command structure. He's the embodiment of a leader who let reputation outrun reality. Officers are taught how to think strategically. Custer is the perfect example of what happens when you don't. You've been listening to Deadly Truths, where history meets homicide and the past still echoes with every story we tell. A quick reminder, the cases discussed here involve real people and real tragedy. Please listen with care and remember that respect for victims and their families always comes first. If you found this episode compelling, share it, like it, and follow the show on your favorite platforms: Spotify, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, wherever you listen. Every follow, every share, every review helps this show reach more people who believe, like we do, that the truth should never be forgotten. I'm Becca, and I want to thank you for joining me as we always uncover the stories history tried to bury. Until next time, stay curious, stay cautious, and keep seeking deadly truths.